Illiterate. The word didn't echo, it sliced, clean and precise, through the low hum of $2000, a plate dinner in downtown Manhattan, where crystal glasses caught the golden light and every whispered conversation carried the weight of money. Forks paused midair, a pianist's fingers hovered above ivory keys, and in the center of it all stood Naomi Carter, a black waitress in a pressed uniform, her hands steady around a bottle of Bordeaux as if nothing had happened, as if the insult hadn't just tried to shrink her into something smaller than the room itself. Across from her sat Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire whose name moved markets and whose presence bent conversations, leaning back in a chair that cost more than most monthly rents, his expression calm, almost bored, like a man who had never once been told he was wrong. A few guests exchanged glances, some amused, others uncomfortable, but no one spoke. Because silence in rooms like this wasn't absence, it was agreement. Naomi didn't look at him, not yet, her gaze lowered just enough to remain professional, just enough to keep the illusion intact, but there was something in the stillness of her shoulders, something in the way she placed the bottle down with exact precision, that didn't match the role they had assigned her. Daniel swirled his glass slowly, watching her like a puzzle he had already decided was too simple to solve, then added, his voice light but cutting, "It's not your fault, really. Some people just aren't meant to understand certain things," and a quiet ripple of laughter followed, the kind that asked for permission and got it. Near the edge of the table, a woman in a tailored suit lifted her phone just slightly, angling it without making it obvious, because moments like this, moments where power exposed itself, were currency of a different kind. Naomi exhaled once, soft, controlled, the kind of breath that resets something deeper than composure, and for a second, if anyone had been watching closely enough, they would have noticed it, the shift, not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle recalibration, like a room adjusting its temperature before anyone realizes it's changed, outside the floor to ceiling. Then answered instinctively, almost forgetting where he was, as if the language itself had pulled him into a different reality, one where she was not invisible, not background, but central. The room was no longer silent in the same way, it was charged now, alive with a different kind of attention, the kind that replaces assumption with curiosity. Naomi continued, Spanish this time, then English, each transition seamless. Each sentence placed with intention, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate, like notes in a composition that had been waiting for the right moment to be played. By the time she finished, the energy in the room had shifted completely, the earlier laughter replaced by something quieter, heavier, more honest. Daniel finally leaned forward, his glass untouched now, his gaze fixed on her in a way it had not been before, not dismissive, not amused, but searching, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he had created with the reality unfolding in front of him. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier certainty, and for the first time that evening, Naomi met his eyes, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a calm that did not need permission, and she answered in clear, steady English, "I made sure everyone at this table felt understood." A pause, just enough to let the words land, "Everyone except you," and this time, no one laughed, because the truth, when spoken clearly enough, does not need an audience to validate it. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, each person at the table processing what they had just witnessed in their own way, a woman lowering her phone as if suddenly aware she had been recording something she did not fully understand, a man adjusting his cufflinks with unnecessary precision, another clearing his throat but saying nothing at all, because in rooms like this, people did not rush to fill silence when they were no longer certain who held the authority to speak. Daniel Whitmore sat very still, his fingers resting against the stem of his glass, his mind moving faster than his expression allowed, because this was unfamiliar territory. Not the language, not the skill, but the loss of control, the subtle realization that the narrative he had constructed moments ago had collapsed without resistance. Naomi Carter did not step back, did not retreat into the background role that had been assigned to her. Instead she remained exactly where she was, centered, composed, her presence no longer something to be overlooked but something the entire room had to account for. A man near the end of the table, one of the international investors, leaned forward slightly and spoke in French again, testing, curious, and Naomi answered without hesitation, her response fluid, precise, and this time there was no laughter, no disbelief, only recognition. the kind that does not need to be announced. Daniel finally set his glass down, the soft contact against the table sounding louder than it should have, and he asked, more carefully now, "Where did you learn all of that?" And the question was different from before, stripped of mockery, shaped instead by something closer to respect, or perhaps confusion. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not in challenge but in clarity, and said, "The same way anyone learns anything, I paid attention," and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any long explanation could have, because it removed the mystery and replaced it with something far more unsettling: effort, discipline, time. A few guests exchanged looks, the kind that acknowledged a shift they had not anticipated, because it was easier to believe in rare talent than in consistent work, easier to dismiss someone as an exception than to reconsider the assumptions that had led them to overlook her in the first place. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back again, but this time the posture did not carry the same certainty, the same effortless dominance. Instead it felt measured, recalibrated, as if he were adjusting to a version of the room where he was no longer the unquestioned center. Naomi reached for the bottle once more, refilling a glass with the same steady hand she had before, the same professionalism, but now every movement was being watched, not because she demanded attention, but because she had earned it. Without asking, the city outside remained unchanged, light stretching for miles, traffic flowing in quiet patterns, but inside that dining room, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, not by words, not by status, not by money, because once people see clearly, even for a moment, it becomes much harder to return to the comfort of what they assumed before. The room did not return to normal, it reorganized itself around a new center, subtle but undeniable, like gravity shifting without warning, and for the first time that evening, conversations did not resume out of habit, they restarted with caution, with awareness, with the quiet understanding that something had just been revealed that could not be unseen. Daniel Whitmore studied Naomi Carter in a way he had not studied anyone in years, not as an obstacle, not as background, but as a variable he had failed to account for, and that realization unsettled him more than he would ever admit out loud, because men like him did not build empires by overlooking details, and yet here she was, a detail he had dismissed, now standing at the center of a moment he could no longer control. "You said you paid attention," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of her words, as if searching for something beneath them. And Naomi met his gaze again, calm, steady, without urgency. "Yes," she said. Her voice even, while everyone else was talking, I was listening, and there was no accusation in her tone, no need for it, because the truth had already done the work. A quiet shift moved through the table again, this time not driven by shock but by recognition, the kind that forces people to reconsider not just what they are seeing, but how they have been seeing it all along. One of the investors, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for precision, leaned forward and asked her something in Spanish, more complex this time, layered, almost technical, and Naomi responded without hesitation, her answer clear, structured, thoughtful, not just fluent but informed, and that was when the energy changed again, because fluency could be memorized, but understanding could not be faked. Daniel noticed it too, the difference, the depth, and for a brief moment, he found himself without a prepared response, without the quick calculation that usually followed every interaction, because this was not a negotiation he had anticipated. The pianist in the corner resumed playing, softly at first, as if unsure whether the room was ready for sound again, and the music filled the space carefully, like something testing the air before settling in. Naomi moved to refill another glass, her motions unchanged, but now every movement carried intention, every step observed not because she demanded attention, but because she had altered the rules of how attention was given. Daniel straightened slightly, his voice quieter now, less performative, more direct. "You are not just a waitress," he said, and it was not a compliment, not exactly, more like a correction he was making for himself, and Naomi allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension, but because she did not rush for anyone anymore. "Tonight, I am," she replied, simple, grounded, and that answer did something unexpected. It removed the need for validation, it refused the upgrade he was offering, and in doing so, it shifted the power dynamic even further. A few guests exchanged looks again, but this time there was no confusion, only a quiet agreement that the story they thought they were watching had changed direction entirely. Daniel leaned back once more, but this time the movement felt different, not a retreat, not a defeat, but an adjustment, the kind that comes when someone realizes that the rules they have always relied on do not apply in the same way anymore, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to regain control of the room, he simply observed it, because control, he was beginning to understand, does not always belong to the loudest voice, or the wealthiest man, or the one who speaks first. Sometimes it belongs to the person who understands the room better than anyone else in it, and right now, that person was not him. The rhythm of the room had changed completely now, no longer driven by Daniel Whitmore's presence or his voice, but by a quieter, more deliberate awareness that seemed to follow Naomi Carter wherever she moved, and it was not admiration that filled the space, not yet, but something more complex, something closer to respect mixed with curiosity, the kind that makes people sit a little straighter and listen a little more carefully. A server from across the floor paused for just a second longer than necessary, watching Naomi as if seeing her for the first time, and then quickly returned to work, because even among the staff, something had shifted, a silent recognition that the invisible line between who was seen and who was not had just been redrawn. Daniel tapped his finger lightly against the table, a small, controlled movement, but one that revealed the recalculation happening behind his composed expression, because this was no longer about a moment of embarrassment, it was about a misjudgment, and misjudgments at his level carried consequences. Even if those consequences were not immediately visible. You have been here all night, he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before, and not once did you interrupt, not once did you correct anyone, and Naomi finished pouring a glass before answering, her tone unchanged. It was not my place to interrupt, she said, then added after a brief pause, until it was, and that distinction landed differently, not as defiance, but as clarity, a boundary drawn not by hierarchy, but by principle. One of the younger investors leaned forward, intrigued, and asked, so you just waited for the right moment? And Naomi nodded slightly. I waited until the moment mattered, she replied, and there it was again, that subtle shift, the reminder that timing, not volume, often determines impact. Daniel exhaled through his nose, almost a quiet laugh, but not quite, more like an acknowledgement that he had been outmaneuvered without even realizing a game had begun, and for a man who prided himself on strategy, that realization carried weight. The pianist's melody grew a little stronger now, filling the gaps between words, but no one was really listening to the music, not when something far more compelling was unfolding at the table. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table now. Abandoning the distance he had maintained earlier, 5 languages, he said, almost to himself, then looked at her again, that takes years, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. It does, she said simply, and left it there, no explanation, no justification, because effort does not need to be defended. A woman seated near the center of the table, who had been silent for most of the evening, spoke up for the first time, her voice thoughtful. Why here? She asked, gesturing subtly to the restaurant, the implication clear. Why this job? Why this role? Why this place? And Naomi considered the question for a brief moment, not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose her words carefully. Because this is where people reveal who they are, she said, her voice calm, when they think no one important is watching. And that sentence moved through the table more quietly than any of the languages she had spoken earlier, but it carried more weight than all of them combined. Daniel sat back again, slower this time, his expression no longer guarded, but thoughtful, as if he were seeing not just Naomi, but the entire evening from a different angle, one where the hierarchy he relied on was less stable than he had assumed. Naomi reached for another bottle, her movements as steady as ever, but now every action felt intentional, not just service, but presence. And as she stepped slightly to the side, preparing to continue her work, the room did not return to ignoring her. It followed her, not with their eyes alone, but with their attention, because once someone proves they understand the room better than anyone else in it, they do not need to ask to be seen, they simply are. By now the dinner had lost its original purpose, not in appearance but in meaning, because the contracts, the negotiations, the carefully rehearsed conversations about numbers and expansion had all been quietly pushed to the background, replaced by something far more immediate, far more human, the recognition that value does not always arrive dressed in the way people expect. Daniel Whitmore glanced around the table, not to command attention this time, but to measure it, and what he saw was unfamiliar, eyes that were no longer anchored to him, conversations that no longer waited for his approval to begin or end, and at the center of that shift stood Naomi Carter, not speaking, not performing, simply existing in a way that could not be ignored. He leaned forward again, slower now, as if aware that every movement carried more weight than before. "Tell me something," he said. His voice quieter but more deliberate. "If you understand the room this well, why stay in the background?" And the question was not an insult, not anymore, it was genuine, shaped by curiosity rather than assumption. Naomi placed a folded napkin precisely beside a glass before answering, her movement steady, her tone calm, "Because the background sees everything the spotlight misses," she said, and the sentence did not rise, did not push, it settled, like something that had been true long before anyone at that table had the awareness to recognize it. A subtle shift passed through the guests again, a kind of collective recalibration, as if each person was quietly revisiting their own behavior from earlier that evening, replaying moments they had not considered important at the time. One of the investors, a woman known for her sharp instincts, leaned back slightly and smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition. "You have been studying us," she said, and Naomi met her gaze without hesitation. "I have been observing," she replied, and the difference between those two words hung in the air, precise, intentional, because studying implies distance, while observing implies presence. Daniel let out a slow breath, his fingers no longer tapping, his posture no longer guarded. "And what have you observed?" he asked, and this time, the question carried risk, because it invited an answer he could not predict. Naomi did not rush, did not soften her words, but neither did she sharpen them. She simply spoke. "That people reveal their priorities in small moments," she said. "In how they speak to someone they think does not matter, in what they notice, and in what they ignore," and no one interrupted, because everyone understood, in some quiet, uncomfortable way, that they had all been part of those small moments. The pianist's music swelled slightly, filling the space between her words, but even that felt secondary now, like a backdrop to something more significant. Daniel nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when someone recognizes a truth they cannot easily dismiss, and for the first time that evening, he did not try to respond immediately, did not attempt to reframe the conversation in his favor, he simply sat with it. Naomi reached for another glass, refilling it with the same precision she had shown all night, but now her actions carried a different kind of authority, not assigned, not granted, but earned in real time, through presence, through awareness, through the quiet confidence of someone who does not need to prove anything once it has already been seen. And as the dinner continued, something fundamental had shifted, not just in how the room saw her, but in how they saw themselves, because once someone exposes the gap between perception and reality, it becomes impossible to ignore, and in that space, in that quiet, undeniable clarity, Naomi Carter no longer existed in the background of the room, she had become the standard by which it was being measured. The dinner should have moved on by now, back to contracts and projections and numbers that filled screens and headlines, but it did not, because something more important had taken hold, something no one had planned for and no one could quite step away from. Daniel Whitmore rested his hands flat against the table, no longer tapping, no longer signaling impatience, just still, as if stillness itself had become a strategy he was trying to understand, and for a moment he looked not at Naomi Carter, but at the people around him, the same people who had laughed earlier, the same people who had remained silent, and he saw in their expressions a subtle shift, not judgment exactly, but awareness, the kind that makes a room feel smaller, more honest, less forgiving. He turned back to her, slower this time, more deliberate. "You changed the room," he said, and it was not a question, it was an observation, one that carried more weight than any challenge he had made before, and Naomi did not deny it, did not accept it either. She simply adjusted a glass by a fraction of an inch and said, "The room was always like this," her voice even, "you just did not notice," and that answer did something unexpected. It did not elevate her, it exposed everything else. A quiet tension settled again, not sharp, not uncomfortable, but reflective, like a mirror no one had asked for but could not ignore. One of the investors leaned in, curious. "So what do we miss?" he asked, his tone less confident now, more open, and Naomi glanced around the table once, not to judge, but to acknowledge. "You miss the moments that do not benefit you," she said, "the conversations you think are not important, the people you assume are not relevant," and there was no accusation in her words, only clarity. but clarity can be more confronting than criticism when it leaves no room to argue. Daniel nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, not defending himself, not interrupting, because for the first time that evening, he was not trying to win, he was trying to understand, and that alone marked a shift greater than anything that had been said. The pianist's melody softened again, almost fading into the background, as if the room itself was leaning closer to hear what came next. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, more grounded. "And what would you do differently?" he asked. And this time the question carried weight, because it was no longer about her, it was about him, about the system he represented, about the habits that had built his success but perhaps limited his perspective. Naomi paused, not for effect, but because she chose her words carefully. "I would listen before I decide who matters," she said, simple, direct, and the simplicity made it impossible to dismiss, because it did not attack, it invited reflection. A few guests shifted in their seats, subtle movements that revealed discomfort, or maybe recognition, the kind that comes when a truth lands too close to something personal. Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh but softer, more self-aware. "That would change a lot," he admitted, and Naomi gave a slight nod. "It already did," she replied, and the room understood exactly what she meant. No one looked at her the same way they had an hour ago, no one spoke to her the same way, no one could return to the version of the evening that existed before that single word had been spoken. Because once someone proves that value does not announce itself, that intelligence does not need permission, that presence can shift power without raising its voice, the entire structure of how people measure worth begins to crack, quietly but permanently. And in that moment, without raising her voice, without stepping out of her role, Naomi Carter had not just responded to an insult, she had redefined the rules of the room, and Daniel Whitmore, for the first time in a very long time, was not the one setting them. The conversation did not end, it deepened, settling into something quieter but far more significant than anything that had come before, because now the room was no longer reacting, it was reflecting, and reflection carries a different kind of weight, the kind that lingers long after words have been spoken. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his gaze no longer sharp, no longer calculating in the way it had been at the beginning of the evening, but thoughtful, almost introspective, as if he were tracing the path of his own assumptions backward, trying to understand where they had formed and why they had gone unquestioned for so long. He reached for his glass, then stopped halfway, his hand hovering briefly before he set it back down, a small gesture, but one that revealed something shifting internally, a hesitation that had not existed before. Naomi Carter continued her work with the same steady rhythm, moving between guests, refilling glasses, adjusting place settings, her presence unchanged in action but completely transformed in meaning, because now every movement carried context, every step carried awareness, and no one in the room could separate what she was doing from what she had revealed. One of the guests, the woman who had earlier asked why she worked there, spoke again, her voice softer now, less certain. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked, and the question was not about the job, not really. It was about the weight of being unseen, of being underestimated, of carrying more than people were willing to acknowledge. Naomi paused for just a fraction of a second, not to dramatize the moment, but because the question deserved an honest answer. "Sometimes," she said, her tone calm, "but not in the way you think," and the room leaned in again, not physically, but in attention, because they had learned by now that her words did not come lightly. "I do not get tired of what I know," she continued, "I get tired of how quickly people decide what I cannot know," and that sentence settled over the table like a quiet truth no one could argue with, because it was not specific to her, it was universal, and that made it harder to dismiss. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, as if letting that thought pass through him without interruption. And when he opened them again, there was something different there, not defeat, not regret. Exactly, but awareness, the kind that changes how a person sees not just others, but themselves. "That is fair," he said, and the simplicity of the response carried more weight than any elaborate apology could have, because it did not try to undo what had happened, it acknowledged it. The pianist's music shifted again, a softer progression now, almost reflective, as if the room itself had aligned with the tone of the conversation, and for the first time that evening, the sound felt like it belonged, not as background, but as part of the moment. Naomi nodded slightly, accepting the acknowledgement without needing anything more, and continued her work, because for her, the night had not changed in structure, only in meaning. Daniel leaned back slowly, his posture no longer asserting control, but allowing space, and as he looked around the table again, he saw something he had not noticed before, not just Naomi, but everyone else, the subtle differences in how they held themselves. How they spoke, how they responded, details that had always been there but had never required his attention until now, and in that realization, something shifted again, not in the room this time, but within him. Because understanding, once it begins, does not stay contained to a single moment, it expands, it reframes, it reshapes, and as the dinner moved forward, quieter, more deliberate, less performative, it became clear that what had happened was not just a disruption, it was a recalibration, one that would follow each person beyond that table, beyond that night, into the way they would see the next room, and the next, long after Naomi Carter had finished her shift and stepped out of view, because some lessons do not end when the moment does, they begin there. By the time the final plates were cleared, the room no longer felt like a stage for power, it felt like a place where something quieter and more lasting had taken root, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes everything that follows. Daniel Whitmore remained seated a moment longer than the others, his usual instinct to move first, to lead the exit, to reclaim the rhythm of the room, held back by something he could not quite name, something that asked him to pause instead of proceed. Around him, conversations resumed, but they were different now, softer, more measured, as if each person had become aware of the space between words, of the weight carried in tone, in choice, in attention. Naomi Carter moved through the final steps of her shift with the same steady precision, collecting glasses, aligning chairs, restoring the room to its original order. But nothing about the night could be returned to what it had been, because order is not the same as meaning, and meaning had already changed. Daniel stood slowly, adjusting his jacket out of habit, but even that gesture lacked its earlier certainty, and as he reached for his coat, he hesitated, turning slightly toward Naomi, who was placing the last glass onto a tray. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment did not require urgency, it required clarity. Naomi, he said finally, using her name for the first time, not as a command, not as a formality, but as recognition, and she looked at him, not surprised, not expectant, simply present. He held her gaze for a second. Longer than necessary, as if choosing his words carefully, and then said, "Thank you," and it was a simple phrase, one that might have seemed small in any other context, but here, now, it carried something more, an acknowledgement not just of what she had done, but of what he had learned. Naomi nodded once, accepting the words without amplifying them, without diminishing them, because she did not need more than that. And in that quiet exchange, something resolved, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. Daniel turned toward the exit, joining the flow of guests moving out into the Manhattan night, but his pace was different now, less rushed, more aware, as if the city outside, with its endless motion and ambition, might look slightly different through the lens of what he had just experienced. Naomi continued her work, finishing the final details, placing everything back into alignment. But there was no sense of closure in her movements, only continuation, because for her, this was not a singular moment, it was part of a larger pattern, one she had understood long before anyone else in that room had begun to notice. As the lights dimmed slightly and the last of the guests disappeared into elevators and waiting cars, the room settled into stillness once more, but it was not the same stillness that had existed at the beginning of the evening. It was deeper, more aware, carrying the imprint of everything that had unfolded within it, and somewhere beyond the glass walls, beyond the skyline and the noise and the constant rush of a city that rarely pauses, a quiet truth remained, one that did not belong to any single person at that table, but to anyone willing to see it, that intelligence does not announce itself, that dignity does not ask for permission, and that sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that never needed to be the loudest, only the one that chose the right moment to be heard.